The Minister also alluded to our next speaker being the keynote for this morning. Now, this morning is going to go right through to lunchtime. So there's going to be two parts to it, the pre-morning tea and then the post-morning tea. We're getting as much out of this gentleman whilst he's in Australia as we can. He was mentioned previously as being an international authority on child trauma and the fact that he founded the Child Trauma Academy in Houston, Texas. Child psychiatrist, neuroscientist, and an author as well. A more detailed biography is contained within the program. This gentleman was last in Perth in 2012, delivering a seminar on the key principles of neurodevelopment and a neurosequential approach to therapeutic treatment. I've got 100 lines about that saying, but I can't, it's not the forum. He conducted a one-day workshop in Perth yesterday on transforming childhood trauma, a neuroscience approach to healing and recovery. And today, however, he will be talking about trauma experienced by children in out-of-home care, the topic that we're really focusing on, and the support needed for them to achieve good life outcomes. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to formally invite to the stage Dr. Bruce Perry.
Welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of this land, their elders past, present, and I always like to add future. I know that's not part of the whole thing, but for me, it's important. I've had the pleasure of listening to Richard twice, and it's amazing how in such a very short period of time he's able to essentially capture what I want to talk to you about. Because fundamentally, at the end of the day, what I'm trying to convey to you is that as you go through this process of trying to reinvent a new way of dealing with these problems, which, by the way, is a process initiated by our inventing ourselves away from the way we're supposed to live, you are going to need to understand the importance of rhythm and the importance of relationship and the importance of respect. And all of those were both explicitly and implicitly part of Welcome to Country yesterday and the Welcome to Country today. And those, there's a reason that 20,000 generations of human beings have converged on those concepts as being important for our health and welfare. It's, if you want evidence in this evidence-based world, right? We want evidence-informed practice and policy. I can't think of any better evidence than having human beings who survived in the natural world under harsh conditions for 20,000 generations as being an effective and important set of principles that help them stay alive and help them thrive. So what I want to talk about is how those concepts, how those principles play out in the modern world and play out in the modern service delivery model. Because fundamentally what I talk about again and again and again is that what has happened in our modern world is that we have continued to invent ourselves away from our biological gifts. And every time we end up fighting the reality of biology, we lose. And every time we do any policy, practice, or law modification that is respectful of our biological gifts and the biological gifts and realities of other species around us, we actually thrive. So, with that caveat, let me pull my computer up here. Hopefully this will work. I'm not disconnected yet. So, let me start with this. I'm going to talk about a tiny part of what I what I have been learning about some of these issues, and what the working group that I'm part of has been learning about these issues. And we will be, during the next few hours, looking at these issues through this perspective of neurobiology. And I know most of you are not neuroscientists, and this is sort of far afield from what a lot of you feel comfortable with, but I just want to reassure you that there are some really, really simple but important things about the way the brain is organized and the way the brain changes that can help you understand the children and families you're working with and give you some insights about two things. One, why some of the things that you've figured out work, and number two, why some of the things that you think should work don't work. So, I have a bias. I think the brain is really important. I think that it's the organ that's involved in so many of the functions that we value and find important in our culture. And what I'm going to do is talk a lot about some of these key concepts of how the brain is organized, and hopefully in ways that will help us understand the importance of rhythm and relationship. So, first thing, and I'm going to sort of summarize this very quickly. Everybody in this room has one of these. And now this is a picture. This is sort of a hand drawing of what the brain kind of looks like. And the reason I put it up is that I want people to appreciate the fact that the brain is unlike any other organ in your body, in large part because it's more complex and it does more things. And what that means on a little bit of a deeper level is that you can have certain parts of your brain. So for example, most of you have heard of the cortex, this top part of the brain. Certain parts of your brain that mediate some functions, and then other parts of the brain, let's take the brainstem down here, that will mediate other functions. Now these are physically separate parts of the brain, and they mediate completely different functions. Now, the amazing thing is that even though they do mediate different functions, they're connected. They're able to communicate with each other. They're able to influence each other in ways that are really important. But the key thing is this, is that you can have a brain that has all kinds of systems and networks that mediate all manner of human behavior, human thinking, human sensory perception, human motor control, and all of this stuff is essentially either directly or indirectly controlled by your brain. And so our fundamental, premise in why we think it's important for people to understand a little bit about the brain is that really it's the organ that mediates what we are. It is the organ that allows us to have speech and language. It's the organ that stores our personal narrative history. It's the organ that allows us to perceive. It's the organ that allows us to communicate. And one of the fundamental things about this really complex organ is that we have certain very important networks that help us connect all these different parts of the brain to help us work in a seamless way. So you've got 86 billion neurons, and somehow you're able to get those things to all work together to help create what you think is this seamless representation of the world. But the truth is, it's not. Your brain is basically helping you put together some representation of what's really out there. You're only capturing a portion of what is true. But your brain makes you feel as if you really are in the moment, in the present. You're really perceiving everything out there. You're able to communicate and interact with people. But it's a very interesting thing when you look at it. We're essentially only focusing on a component of the world for about 9 to 10 seconds, and then we're internalizing, we're focusing on our inner world, and then we go back to the outside world. Now, how many of you know how movies are made? You guys know how movies are? Movies, we can watch a movie and it looks like it's really happening, right? We see movement, we see dialogue, but the truth is, it's just a bunch of still photos. And there's a certain number of photos per every second. And the reality is, in between each one of those seconds, if you show one picture per 2 seconds, you end up actually having more of the time that goes by that you have nothing in there than you have the image. And that's the way the real world is. You create this internal representation of this outside world, thinking that you're having this seamless sort of experience with the world, but you're missing everything. I mean, not to make you feel completely uncomfortable, but you're missing a lot. And the interesting and fascinating thing is when you talk to an Aboriginal elder, they know all about this. They know all about these gaps in sensory perception. And it's in these spaces where we're not conscious, where real life occurs. Now, I don't want to go too far in that or you'll think I'm crazy, but this is one of the things about the brain. There are lots of things about the brain, how it's organized and how it works, that if we understand, it gives us a completely different perspective on our own experience. So one of the things that I want to teach you about that is one of these learnings is the incredible importance of these networks in the brain. And a little bit about what we call the microarchitecture of how those stress response systems actually work. Because so many of the behaviors that we see with these kids that are struggling, so many of the physical health, mental health, social health, substance abuse problems that these individuals are dealing with have to do with how these networks were altered in their functioning. So let me just back up a second and remind you, I said this already, your brain has 86 billion neurons. That's a lot. Each neuron has 200 to 2,000 connections with other neurons, and it is through creating chains of interactive connectivity that function occurs. Now, you don't see things because, your eyeball is directly connected to, let me get a picture here. You don't see things because your eyeball is directly connected to, let me get my pen here, sorry, to this perceptive part of your brain up here. In order for you to see something, light has to come in here. Photons are translated into patterned neuronal activity, and this part of the brain connects to this part of the brain. Then it sends a signal up to this part of the brain, the middle part of the brain, then it sends a signal to this part of the brain, and then finally, when it gets up there, you see. So vision is created by a chain of interconnected neurons. Now, the reason I'm going to give you this example is, and hopefully you'll get this in a minute, is that the fundamental process of taking in the outside world and actually responding to your own inner world involves a sequence of communication steps between the lower part of the brain and then the middle parts of the brain and then the top parts of the brain. So, when you see something, the first place that you get information from the outside world is down here in a lower part of your brain. Now, I haven't talked about this too much, but this lower part of your brain, even though it's amazing and magnificent, it's not very complex. It mediates very simple things. Sleep, heart rate, blood pressure. This part of the brain does not have the capacity to tell time. So when you actually have your initial perception of the world, you have no idea at that level that you are in 2015 and that you're not back in 2000 when somebody beat the hell out of you. Your brain might actually perceive the moment if the incoming signals are similar to something that happened in 2000 when you had the hell beat out of you by a person who had the same attributes as this person now trying to teach you algebra. Your brain is going to go, hey, I'm under threat. Let me elaborate this a little bit more just so you actually believe what I'm talking about. If you take somebody who is got normal vision, and they've got this normal intact sequence of the visual pathway is intact, and they have a head injury, and this happens all the time. It could be a car accident. They'll be blind. You can damage the occipital cortex, your visual cortex, and you'll be blind. But if you go up to that person and their eyes still work, their eyeballs are still working, If you go up to that person and you push at them like this, fast, guess what they do? They jump. They blink and jump. That's called precortical processing. They're completely blind. But they do that because these lower parts of the brain, every part of your brain has the ability to process and act on information that's coming in. Now, these lower parts of the brain will act on information if it is of sufficient intensity or if it is in some way connected with previous threat. So let me give you another example. Everybody in this room has sort of accidentally touched something hot, right? Well, the reality is you've withdrew your hand before you even knew what it was that burned your finger. And so many of us have recalled, if you walk through that, you know that you actually withdraw your hand and you look at it and you go, what was that? Because if the signal came in that, oh, your hand is burning, I better send this up to this part of the brain that will actually make me feel pain. Okay, now you feel pain. I better actually find out where I'm feeling pain from. Oh, you're feeling pain. Actually, a lot of tissue damage, by the way. It's on the left-hand side of your body. Now, I don't know whether it's hand, foot, whatever. Let's move that up to the cortex. The cortex can figure that out. The cortex, oh, I'm actually feeling pain. I've localized the pain. Let me send a little signal to this part of the brain to actually move my head to kind of see what it is. And then, oh, let's actually go through this loop again to make a decision that maybe I should actually withdraw my hand. Yeah, let's send a signal down to your arm that say, pull your hand away. By the time you did that, you'll be baked. Now, I'm sort of joking about this, but many of you who are in the field of child abuse and neglect know that there's a very famous chart that has temperature of water and duration of time required to actually create a third-degree burn. And so when you're in the ER and you see a kid come in with a burn all over his hand and you hear the story, oh, that he put his hand in boiling water, that's bullshit. Because if you put your hand in boiling water, you withdraw it so fast. The only way you get a burn like that is if somebody held your hand in boiling water. So your brain is trying to protect you. Unfortunately, your brain doesn't always, your brain basically has to figure out the present, what's happening in the present, by filtering all of the stuff that's coming in through the stored experiences of your past. And so if earlier in your life you had an experience where you made an association between loud, unexpected noises or a raised voice and eye contact as painful, as opposed to a raised eye and eye contact as having an excited uncle talking about the Yankees. If you had eye contact and a raised voice and somebody slapped you across the face, that's a completely different set of associations. And so as you get older and you get into some interaction with somebody and the teacher gets excited about some subject and they look at you like, I'm going to socially engage you and get you motivated in this topic, this little kid's brain goes, I'm under threat. This cataloging of experiences is one of the fundamental issues that we struggle with all the time with these kids. And it's coupled with another neurobiological phenomenon. So I've talked a little bit about this concept of creating associations. We tend to create associations or connections between two patterns of neural activity that co-occur. Now, this happens in a lot of ways, both good and bad. This is how we learn language. Language is you hear a sound, hear a sound, hear a sound, hear a sound, see something, see something, see something, see something. Ultimately, you create literally a synaptic connection that makes you have a memory. Memory is essentially facilitated and created by the interconnectedness of neurons. And we create these associations about everything that we experience. One of the interesting things about neurons and neural networks is that they are malleable and that they're changeable. And your brain has the ability to make new memory. And your brain can do all kinds of miraculous, amazing things. But the truth is your brain has finite space. And it has finite capacity to make associations. So what your brain has to do is that the first time you experience something new, and there's this new experience, and there's a set of neural activations that co-occur based upon this experience. If it happens with sufficient pattern, you make associations and you make memory. Unfortunately, I guess I shouldn't say unfortunately, because it's a wonderful, wonderful gift. This use-dependent development of the brain, which I'm going to just give you a little bit of a sense of. And look at that, I used to have brown hair. First time I came to Perth, I looked like that. That's 12 years ago or 15 years ago. Anyway, all right, so this is a plate of living neurons. They're moving. That's a dynamic system. Now right here, it's a magnification. Here's one neuron, here's another neuron. They have all of these little neurofilaments, and they're going to make a set of associations, a set of connections. And if you envision the speech and language part of the brain, for example, this could be the pattern of neural activity in the primary association area that would be created if you saw the visual image of a dog. This could be the pattern, the neuronal system that's being stimulated because of the sound of the bark of the dog, or let's say it's the sound of somebody saying the word dog. And if this happens with sufficient frequency, here's what happens. Dog, 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 dog. You literally weave this together. So these become interconnected so seamlessly that the next time you see a dog, it will stimulate your auditory cortex. And in your head, inside of your head, you've created meaning out of this dog. And that sound now is connected to that image. And if somebody says dog, you literally know what that means now. You know that that is this creature, this four-legged furry creature. But this has created what we call a template. Because your brain, it takes a tremendous amount of energy to do this. It takes a lot of energy, a lot of calories, and your brain can't make a brand new association about every single aspect of every single experience. So what your brain does is the next time you see something that's similar to a dog, your brain basically says that's a dog. So this is really the template memory for four-legged furry creatures. And what will happen is this little boy will go over to visit grandma, and grandma will have a cat. And he'll point at the cat and go, dog. And grandma will go, no, honey, that's a cat. And he'll go, I'm pretty sure that's a dog. I'm pretty sure that's a dog. Because it stimulates the dog pathway. Now, what happens is grandma says, no, it's like a dog, but it's got pointed ears, and it's a little bit smaller, and it's got these whiskers. And pretty soon what his brain does is it doesn't erase this association. It adds another connection. So that a cat is a variation of this four-legged furry dog. So cats become dogs that have pointed ears and have an attachment problem. That's a joke. That's a cat joke. Sorry. I can look out there and I see cat owners. They're misunderstood. They're really misunderstood. Right. So, now it's interesting, in the Blackfoot language, the word for dog is one syllable. The word for horse is two syllables, with the first syllable being dog. And the word for elk is the two syllables that go for horse, but another syllable that basically means, big horse, right? Big dog, that's what horse means. And big dog with horns is what elk means. And basically, that's an example of language showing you how you create that. I suspect it's the same thing in many other languages. But the point here, for those of you who are interested in out-of-home care, is that when you're a little child and you're making your primary associations about what human beings are, you create these templates based upon the way you were treated by your primary carers. And if your primary carers were overwhelmed and depressed and resource depleted and had substance abuse challenges and were unable to be fully attentive, fully attuned, fully responsive, two things will happen, one of which I'll talk about in a moment. But what happens with this set of associations that we broadly call attachment is that your internal representation of what people are is not that they're safe and predictable and nurturing and rewarding, is that people are unpredictable, people are threatening sometimes, people will hurt me if I let them get too close, and people abandon me. And so these kids develop what we call relational sensitization, relational sensitivity. And all of you in this room have had the experience of working with kids where you were consistent and predictable, consistent, predictable, consistent, predictable, consistent, predictable, and the first time you got mad at them, they went, see, people don't like me. They have this internal representation that people are not consistent and predictable, and there's nothing worse than having your worldview challenged. Once you create these templates about how the world makes sense and what the world is like, your brain seeks out reinforcers or evidence to prove that you're right, and it tends to ignore stuff that says you're wrong. And it's just like your brain, it's sort of like watching a political debate, right? Your brain, two different brains can have the exact same experience, but one brain that says people are good basically pays attention to the nice parts of that dialogue, and the part of your person who says people are not good, they'll focus on the fact that, man, see, he was kind of rude, and he did this, and he did that, and blah, blah, blah. And it's like arguing Bible verses, right? People literally view the world through the lens of these early developmental experiences. And part of the challenge you all have with kids in out-of-home care is that not all of them, but many of them have had this fractured relational experience. Now, keep that in mind. I'm going to come back and talk about that and how that plays out in real-life work in a minute. But the other thing I wanted to talk about what happens, it's very, very important for understanding the behavior of these kids, and actually all human behavior, is that there are certain patterns of activation of these stress response systems that will result in these systems being flexible, these systems being well organized, these systems being able to help you deal with unpredictability, et cetera, et cetera. So many of you know a lot about the stress response. You've read about it, you've heard about it. Your body and your brain have multiple ways to deal with stressors, unpredictable and predictable. And everybody, every day, goes through, from morning to night, experiences that will activate your stress response. So traffic, or having to give a presentation, or having a discussion with a supervisor, or having to parent your kids, all of these have elements of activating your stress response. But most of these stressors are very moderate, and they tend to be relatively controllable, and most of the time they're predictable. You know that you're going to have a job review. You know that you're going to get into traffic. So those experiences actually will stimulate the brain in one way, and let me put this up. Whereas the experiences of many of the kids that we work with and of their parents have not been of this predictable, moderate, and controlled way. They have been unpredictable, severe, and prolonged. So it's an interesting thing. Stress, oddly enough, is a good thing. The only way you can become resilient is through stress. Stress has kind of been pathologized by the mental health field, mostly because when people tend to talk about stress, they tend to talk about these kinds of stressors. But the fact is, it's important to remember that stress is actually good. The second thing that's really important to remember, and this is a little bit of a challenge, is that the very principle of neuroplasticity, which is basically a phrase people use to talk about the ability of neural networks to change. So neurons can change. You can learn new things. You can change all parts of the brain through all of your life. However, you have to adhere to certain principles. And one of the most fundamental and important principles of neuroplasticity is what we call specificity. Very simple concept. that you cannot expect any neural network in the brain to change unless you activate it, right? You can't expect somebody to learn Russian unless somebody speaks Russian to them. It's absurd. You can't expect somebody to ride a bicycle if they haven't gotten on a bicycle. You can't have them read a book about bicycle riding and expect them to ride a bicycle. You can't show them a videotape and expect them to ride a bicycle. So sometimes we have parenting classes. Just saying. If you look at, and seriously, this is the kind of thing that you should think about when you're redesigning your system. Is the book learning part of parenting what we're really concerned about? Or should we actually let people show people, have people hold a child? I mean, you really can teach somebody to become a better parent, but you really can only teach somebody to be a better parent while they're parenting. This is a very challenging thing for our field, but there's lots of really good programs that, for example, PCIT, Parent-Child Interactive Therapies, is teaching somebody in the moment while they're actually parenting, while they're actually activating the parts of the brain involved in the complexity of what it means to be with your child, they're helping you be better at it. It can be helpful, and it can be an adjunct to watch a videotape of somebody doing it. It can be helpful to kind of read something about what might be helpful. But the truth is, ultimately, you got to get on the bicycle. And I don't care if you're the best, Tiger Woods 94 video game player. You're not going to be a good golfer until you put a golf club in your hands. So, back to this whole concept of the pattern of stress activation. If you take your stress response networks and they have a certain level of activity like this, we all know we have a day, this is sort of our set point of where our stress response systems are regulated. We'll have times when they have to be a little bit more activated and times when we're a little bit disengaged. And so this is a rhythmic thing. But if we have a moderate stressor, we will have a predictable peak level of activation, and we'll have a certain duration of activation. So any of you who've gone through any kind of partially stressful experience know what I mean. It could be like going to court and testifying, right? You're pretty stressed. You have a certain peak level, and then as you start to do okay and the event ends, you get back to your baseline. And so everybody has these kinds of things. The problem is, if you have a pattern of stress response activation that involves something like this, where you have a moderate stressor, and then before you can get back to your baseline, there's another stressor, even a small one, and then another one, and then a big one, and et cetera, your baseline starts to shift. So if your resting heart rate here is 80 beats per minute, and you go through this sensitizing pattern of activation to stress response, your heart rate can get up to be, at baseline, 110. Furthermore, you become not only more tuned up, you become more reactive. So when you are exposed to a moderate stressor, just like this one over here, you have a much greater response. And of course, all of you who work with these kids know that many of these kids have that characteristic. They have an extremely robust response to a relatively minor challenge, like make your bed, or let's get ready for school, or it's time to stop playing, or whatever. And they'll have a response that is disproportionate to the stressor, because it really is a challenge. It's a stressor. Believe it or not, when you go from the sitting position to the standing position, that's a physiological stressor. But most of us are so neurotypically organized that when we have these tiny little stress activations, it doesn't really influence us. We could basically get a full bladder and we don't melt down. We can get a cold and we don't melt down. We can have a little bit of unpredictability in the schedule and we don't melt down. But if you have a sensitized stress response system and you have a relatively minor stressor, like, you said we were going to go to the zoo at 3 and we're going to go at 4, they'll have a meltdown. unpredictability or perceived unpredictability, changes in schedule, tiny little raising of the voice, physical proximity, transitions, all kinds of things that for you and I, we don't even recognize these as stressors. But if you could look at our heart rate, you could look at our physiology, you'd see they're tiny little stress activators. But if you have this sensitized system, you have tremendous changes in cognition, in behavior, in relational capabilities, because all functioning of the brain is what we call state dependent. And the fundamental thing that you see as you go down this arousal continuum, and I don't know if I have it in here. I probably don't. I have it in this set of slides. A fundamental observation when you do this shift in stress response is that the part of your brain that is in control of your functioning shifts. So, when you are not hungry, not thirsty, you don't have any physiological distress that's coming from your internal sensory environment, and your external sensory environment is generally relatively predictable, familiar, not chaotic, not threatening, you can use this really, really smart part of your brain. But what happens is once the world starts to get a little bit more activating, a little bit more complex, like you go to work, you have a conversation with somebody, you get pulled out of this internal reflective state and you're externally focused. And the truth is, when you're externally focused, when you're actually in a state that will allow you to learn new content, put new content into your head, you're not in the same state that allows you to use that content in the most creative way. So the interesting thing is, if you looked at this moment to moment, you cannot learn and create at the same time. However, you can cycle back and forth very quickly between an externally focused and an internally focused state. And in fact, you guys have been doing this all morning. You've been hearing something I say, you've been reflecting on it, and while you're reflecting on it, whether you believe it or not, you're missing part of what I say, and then you come back out. Now, your brain thinks that you've been hearing me continuously. And so for me, this is sort of an interesting little sport. One of the things that, because people will come up and go, when you said, that the brain doesn't change after age 3, and I'm like, whoa. Like, I never said anything like that. But what happens is this: when you take information in from the outside world, it goes into this little place we call active working memory. Active working memory, envision it like a cup with a hole on the bottom. And all the stuff that comes into active working memory in the beginning comes from the outside world. And it starts to filter into this sponge that it's sitting on, and we call that short-term memory. And so I'm pouring all of this stuff into your active working memory, and it gets to this certain point and it's full. And your brain basically says, oh man, I can't take any more of this. This is too much. So you disengage and you go back into your own inner world and you go, I wonder if this is what he's talking about. I wonder what this has to do with this. And I wonder, what's an evocative cue and blah, 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 blah. Does he dye his hair? No. Clearly you can see it's gray. So whatever you're thinking about, lunch, what'll happen is I'll change the slide. Or I'll raise my voice, or I'll do something and it will pull you back out, and you'll focus outside for a little while. But part of what you do is you pull some of the stuff that you've been thinking about into active working memory. And then it will soak into short-term memory, and over time you think that it's something that I said, but it's really something that you tagged to one of your own things that you used to make sense out of what I was saying. It was a contextualized thought of yours that you brought into active working memory that then you remember as something I said. So all over the world, there's people that are giving me credit for stuff I didn't say. Both good and bad, So now the thing I wanted to say was this. If you are neurotypically organized, if you have been lucky enough to have pretty healthy developmental experiences and your stress response system has this linear relationship between external challenge and internal response, most of us are able to cycle back and forth between this state and this state. But the children, and often the parents of the children we work with, they tend to have a starting point that is right here. And one of the things that is characteristic of being in this state is that, number one, you have partially, not completely, but partially shut down the smartest part of your brain. Number two, you've partially shut down the part of your brain that has the long-term view, that really views time in this abstract way, and you're more concerned about the moment. This is really important because so many of our efforts to talk to these kids and their parents about what they need to do for the long term literally gets into this part of the brain, bounces around, and goes nowhere. Because it does not mean anything to them. And I'll come back and talk about why they'll sit there and look at us and nod, and we think that they're getting it, but they're not. But the point is this: state-dependent functioning means that as you get more threatened and feel more under duress, that you are controlled by increasingly lower parts of your brain that have increasingly less sophisticated problem-solving capabilities, increasingly less concern about the consequences of your behavior for the future, and increasingly less complex problem-solving capabilities. So literally, you can take people who have IQs of 130 and you can put them in a tiny, tiny little stressful situation and they will solve problems with an IQ of 120. You can take people with an IQ of 125 and you put them in an environment, and this is so interesting. For those of you who are interested in what it's like to be in a minority in a majority population, here's what happens. And this is about the neurobiology of expectation. If you take a bunch of people and the lowest IQ in the group is 125 and the highest is 130. Now that's not a big difference that's a bunch of smart people. But if you tell everybody in the group what the other person's IQ is and ask them to solve a problem as a group and then individually, here's what you find. The people who have the highest IQ end up solving the problem with an IQ equivalent of about 118 points. The people who have an IQ of 125 end up solving the problem with an IQ of 104. In other words, they live up to the expectation. They feel that they're not as smart as the other people, and literally there's this disengagement from that process. And many of you know about the neurobiology of expectation, the neurobiology of, testing with minority kids when they're told, well, give it a shot, as opposed to, you can do this, I know you can, you're smart. This is powerful stuff. All functioning of the brain is state dependent. So, what determines what state you are in? Two things are important in our world that it's number one, your baseline state of regulation. Whether or not you have had a history of a sensitizing set of experiences is one of the determinants. The second major determinant is the relational milieu. I kind of talked about this before. If you're with other people, they literally can change your internal state. You can be with people if they're projecting nonverbal signals of engagement and acceptance, you actually can become better regulated. If they send signals of exclusion or hostility, you become more dysregulated. Everybody in this room has probably had an experience working in a hostile or an uncomfortable work setting, right? Where they weren't respected or their supervisor didn't understand them. It just felt not good. It changes your physiology. There's a huge body of literature about what it's like to work in a hostile work environment. It changes your physical health. It changes your physical health because the stress response systems that I talked about earlier, that I showed you this little diagram about, these systems in the brain not only are involved in influencing functioning upstream, thereby controlling sleep, attention, mood, substance, reward-related things, cognition. They also influence the autonomic nervous system, the neuroendocrine system, and the neuroimmune system. So anything that helps these neural networks develop normally leads to improvement in integrated physical health, emotional health, cognitive health, et cetera, et cetera. Anything that compromises the development of these networks that can create a sensitizing pattern of activation of those systems, intrauterine insults, intrauterine such as alcohol, methamphetamine, stress and distress to the mother. Perinatal attachment disruptions, because in early life, the major determinant of how your stress response system ends up being regulated is how your primary carers interact with you. If you're hungry, thirsty, cold, and you cry and they come and meet your needs, you end up having a whole pattern of experience that creates this. And now you remember, just remember what I said earlier about this, right? Predictable, moderate, controlled activation of your stress response is essential for you to develop resilience. And when you are a newborn child and you are just out of the womb, you have entered a sensory environment that's completely novel and unique, which activates the stress response in extreme ways. But typically, the carer will basically re-expose you to intrauterine cues. They'll swaddle you, warm you, turn the lights down, and rock you. And these things are regulating. And when you become regulated, you go back down here, you sort of become unconscious. We sometimes label that sleep. It's not really what we come to understand as sleep later on, but it's a sleep-like state. But at some point, now remember, in here, in utero, the fetus is getting nonstop calories. The fetus is always at 98.7. The fetus has adequate liquid because, it's liquid. The whole thing's liquid in there. So you're not dehydrated, you're not hungry, you're not cold, you're regulated, right? But at the same time, what's happening in utero is that while you're getting feedback from your own little fetal body up into your brainstem, getting these little patterns, I'm regulated, I'm regulated, I'm regulated, through your ears and through your skin, you are actually getting rta, 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 non-stop rhythm. So your brain makes an association between being regulated and rhythm. And so as you get older, any syncopated rhythm that has 20, 40, 60 beats per minute as part of the core rhythm is going to make you feel more regulated. And so all across every culture on the planet, infants are rocked at roughly the same rhythm. Now, if mom had high resting heart rate, they need a faster rock because that's what they made the association between, that rhythm. If mom's like Kate, trained athlete, resting heart rate's 48 beats per minute, this little jazz baby. It needs a different rhythm. But the point is, you create a set of powerful associations between pattern, repetitive, somatosensory activity, and being regulated. So, this is reinforced by these experiences. After you're born, you get hungry because you're not getting nonstop calories anymore. It sends a signal to the lower part of your brain, wakes you up, you open your eyes. There's sensory novelty, which is actually one of the things that happens to the stress response. Again, one of the fundamental learnings that you all can incorporate when you think about out-of-home care. Novelty in and of itself, of any kind, is going to activate the stress response of the kids you work with. Now, if you superimpose that with an understanding of the sensitized stress response, what that means is when you do a new thing, let's go to the zoo, let's go here, you think this is great, this is such a nice thing to do, let's go to the mall. things that you think are going to be nice new adventures for these children very often are going to push them up the arousal continuum, and they're going to be just on the edge of being able to tolerate that experience. And they're very likely to have higher probabilities of meltdowns, difficulties with ending whatever activity you start, all kinds of things. And everybody in this room who's done out-of-home care with these kids understands that. You see it all the time. These kids love predictability. And when you change the schedule, they're like, oh my God, some of these kids are so sensitive, they go apeshit, which is an American medical term. Sorry. But so key learning, very simple learning, lots of implications. Novelty in and of itself is a tremendous potential evocative cue. And it could be relational novelty, it could be novelty of context, it could be novelty of touch, novelty of sound, anything. Second thing that's very, very important, because these kids have this sensitized stress response system, they're going to be much, much, much more triggered and reactive when they have a sleep deprivation, when they're hungry, you know, because all of us get a little grumpy when we're hungry. Sometimes these kids, when they're hungry, again, instead of having this linear relationship between internal response and external challenge, they have this overreaction. So sometimes if they're hungry, they'll have a behavior, and we won't necessarily make the connection, but if you map this out, one of the things we do with all these families we work with, keep very good records and develop a map of when these things occur. And what you find is, oh my God, it's after school if they haven't eaten. It's you know, in the morning before they eat. And the key is, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, if you regulate a child before you have any significant relational demand or any significant cognitive demand, you're going to be much more successful. So novelty is one of those evocative cues. So this kid wakes up, sees novelty, is physiologically hungry. Really, this is an unfamiliar state. I've never really been hungry before. They're distressed. And so the infant's equivalent of the fight or flight response is to cry. And if you have a present, attentive, attuned, and responsive carer, this carer will come in and put the baby to her breast or give a bottle and warm the child and typically start to have some rhythmic activity. If it's not rhythmic motor activity, which it almost always is, they will also have rhythmic relational activity. That's like this. You look, and then you look away. You look, and you look away. That's rhythmic. And when you study this in the maternal-infant interaction, it's a submultiple of these primary rhythms. Because as you all know, if you just stare at somebody, it starts to get a little creepy, right? It's dysregulating. You know, you go from being, social engagement, and then it's like, okay, look away. Yes, as Americans, we're a little intrusive, sorry. So, this is the pattern of attentive, attuned care that can lead to this wonderful, if you will, regulated and resilient child. In contrast, if you have a carer who is overwhelmed, who is depressed, who's in a domestic violence relationship, her ability, if she's on her own with multiple kids, few resources, no connection to community, no connection to extended family, it's so interesting, so many of our well-intended interventions end up fragmenting these families even more. Like, this happens all the time in the U.S. and big cities. Let's not ghettoize our poor. Let's take these poor families and let's put nice low-income housing 35 miles away from the place they come from. So they have a nice little place to live, but they don't know anybody in the community. They're not, their church is so far away. And of course, most of those planners forget that, you really have a nice freeway system, but these people don't have cars because, oh, by the way, they don't have jobs. And oh, by the way, anyway, I could go on and on about it. But the reality is so many well-intended things we do end up further fragmenting these families and tearing up social fabric so that when you're on your own, you're with a new baby and a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, and you're trying to get the neighbor you really don't know very well to sort of take care of them so you can take care of your baby. This just doesn't happen very much. And so the infant gets a pattern of attention that ends up becoming sensitizing. So these kids literally, by the time they're 3 months, are harder to soothe than they were the day they were born. And you end up with this dysregulated child and an overwhelmed parent, and you increase the probability that she is going to be struggling with that child. A couple things about that. Again, if you think about this, if you have individuals who have this sensitized stress response system, the whole range of neurotypical sort of responses to expectations will be something that is impossible for them to actually master. So as interveners, little things like your appointment is next Wednesday and here's my office. That seems like, you should be able to do that if you're 25 years old. But that's an overwhelming thing for anybody to do when they're in this state. The part of your brain that actually can sort of plan and anticipate is shut down when you're in this state. So what'll happen is, even though she's got a whole week to think about the bus route that she would take and make arrangements for somebody to take care of the other kids, what happens is it rolls around till it's the morning of her appointment. And then it becomes a relevant thing to do. And then she can't secure childcare. And so she just doesn't come. And we think it's because she's intentionally this or that. And again, we're interpreting her behavior through our lens. What would make me not come to an appointment? I would not want to come to an appointment because I was angry or I was being passive aggressive or whatever. We are so quick to interpret in a pejorative way some of these really expectations that are unrealistic if you understand state-dependent functioning. Now, here's the good news. The good news is that the brain is malleable. And you can take a sensitized stress response and you can actually make it less sensitized by giving people opportunities for moderate, predictable activation of their stress response. How do you do that? This is where the relationship part comes in. You do this by letting individuals have control of and opportunities for revisiting in a relational way whatever their stressor is or whatever their challenge is. Let me take a second and talk about this from this perspective, and I'm going to, again, change slides here. So just hold all this stuff. I'm going to try to tie this all together ultimately, and I know I'm going all over the place, but ultimately this hopefully will make some sense when I tie it together. But let me get this slide. So one of the things that we have been very interested in is relationships. And we've been interested in the fact that we have been inventing this modern world. You know, one of the great things about our brain is that we are able to essentially invent new things. And you guys, this is what this whole conference is about. You are involved in inventing new systems, new practices, new programs. It is part of a social cultural evolutionary process. You know, the mere fact, I mean, this is an interesting thing. I always sort of wonder how advanced any culture can claim to be when they have to actually have a $1 billion a year agency. And of course, if you take this across the Western countries and look at the billions of dollars that we have to spend on structured, organized agencies that have the responsibility of protecting children from their parents. That's not an indicator of a healthy culture. And I don't say this to sort of, be too negative, but I think it's a very sobering concept that part of what we've been forced to do is invent and create these systems because something has happened in the inventing process that has resulted in us being highly vulnerable to things that would not normally occur in the natural world. So there's a couple of things. Not only is there a social cultural evolution, we can invent new things and pass them on to the next generation, there's also social cultural devolution. We can take learnings and wisdom that previous generations are giving us that we just start to ignore. And part of what I think we have been doing in this inventing process is we've been neglecting our most important gifts. And of these is, I think, probably the most important, is the power of relationships. The fact that human beings are relational creatures. Now, all this stuff I talked about beforehand, about sensitization of the stress response system and all of that stuff is interrelated to relational neurobiology. So let me just sort of give you the context before this and then before we take this break. If you look at human beings have been living together in multi-generational, multi-family groups for the majority of the time we've been on this planet. And even as we started to invent agriculture and live in larger groups and sort of get into the sort of the pre-modern world where we were in lots of cultures trading with each other, we still had fundamentally a relational environment that was much richer than our current relational milieu. We had people lived in closer proximity. The concept of private property was a little different. The buildings we built, the public spaces were different. We literally spent more time in proximity with other people. And this is important. It's important because the more we've invented this modern world, the more we've, oddly enough, if you look at sort of the size of urban settings, they've gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, but the actual individual household has gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. So that in the last U.S. Census, 1/3 of the people in the United States live alone. There's a survey that the University of Chicago does every 5 years or so where they ask people, if you really got into trouble, how many people do you really trust who you could reach out to and sort of talk to about that big issue? And it like 25 years ago, it was something like 3.4. The last one that I saw that was done about 8 years ago was 0.6. The average person doesn't even have one person that they feel like they could trust and reach out to if they had a major problem. So in households, not only are we having fewer interactions with our multiple generations or our extended family or our neighbors, we're spending more and more time in front of a screen. So we can be with people, but we're not relationally engaged with people. Now, all of this stuff is something that many of us perceive. This is one of the most commonly talked about issues in the corporate sector. It's known to be connected to lack of productivity, lack of creativity. There are people trying to figure out how to recapture relational health, so to speak. In some ways, some of the online apps have been trying to do that, but in sort of odd ways. People have, I talk about it all the time. You may have 5,000 friends on Facebook, but you don't have anybody you can go watch a movie with, go have lunch with. We live in a very fragmented culture. And part of the result of this changing landscape is that people are having far, far fewer relational interactions. Now, what I'll talk about a little bit more explicitly after the break is that the brain, and I haven't really focused on this that much, but your brain has in the majority neural networks that are designed to be in relational interactions. So the cognitive parts of your brain are literally hardwired to be very responsive to relationally mediated cognitive content. In other words, you learn concepts much faster in context of a relationship than in context of anything else. We are regulated in the presence of other people. Our blood pressure is different. Whether we feel safe or not is related not to whether or not we're literally being threatened, but how we perceive the relational milieu. So you can be in a life-threatening situation, but if the people around you are projecting signals of acceptance and engagement and they stay regulated, your stress response system doesn't have this extreme response. In contrast, if you have this relational poverty, you have this significant stress response, even though what's threatening you is not life-threatening. In other words, relationships and relational health, connection to community, connection to culture are protective under duress and threat, and they heal if you have been impacted by trauma and threat. And so the key challenge to out-of-home care is, are you building relational connections that are culturally informed in ways that will allow culture to be a therapeutic experience? And I would argue that most of the time we're not. I would argue that unfortunately even our well-intended efforts to help these kids ends up creating fragmentation. I can't tell you how many times I'll review a case of a child who's had 30 placements. And now each one of the placements, there may be a few that are bad, but most of them are people that are trying to do the right thing, they're trying to be nice. It's not like they're evil, typically. They frequently don't understand these kids, and because of that, there's a mismatch between expectation and what these kids can do, and then there's sort of conflict, and then they go, I can't do this, and they pass them on. But the very act of passing them from one place to the next undermines the fundamental vehicle for ultimate healing, and that is relational permanence. Let me just take the last couple minutes here and sort of cycle around and talk about some of this stuff. Now, many of you may or may not have heard of the adverse childhood experience studies. How many of you have heard of that? In the child welfare world, you guys should have heard of this, right? If you haven't, go look it up. ACEs, adverse childhood experience studies. If you take adults, this is from a study done 20 years ago. It's turned out to be one of the major public health studies in changing policy and practice around the world. But right now in the U.S., every single state is incorporating understanding these principles into child welfare redesign, public health redesign, and so forth. Here's the bottom line. This study done 20 years ago looked at 17,000 adults. They looked at their physical health, mental health, social health, employability, academic histories, blah, blah, blah. Here's what they found. If you also looked retrospectively at whether or not they had any of these bad things happen, they found that your risk for having heart disease, lung disease, diabetes, alcoholism, other forms of substance abuse, mental health problems, divorce, unemployability, all of these things that we invent public systems to address. We spend billions of public dollars to address all of the problems that are increased by having these adverse childhood experiences. And so one of the key things, one of the real powerful things about this model is that it actually used language that people who aren't in health and human services like. See, when we talk about emotional functioning and social functioning, policymakers kind of glaze over. But when we talk about heart disease and diabetes, they're like, oh shit, really? That's important. That costs money. So what I've done some work with these folks, but what these studies have done is they've shown that your risk for diabetes, for heart disease, and for asthma skyrockets if you have adverse childhood experiences. In other words, developmental trauma, the kids that we work with, they're going to be not only having more problems in school, not only more problems with relationships, not only more mental health problems, they're going to have more physical health problems. In California, the 4% of kids who are in out-of-home care consume 43% of the Medicaid dollars. That's a huge public health issue. Policymakers sit up when they hear that. So the ACE studies have shown, again, there's a dose-dependent relationship between bad things in childhood and these morbidities that we pay for with these public systems. Both health, social, mental health morbidities. Now, here's the interesting and powerful good news. If you look at relational health factors at the same time, what you find is that if you have an individual who has the same number of adversities, but they have healthy connection to family, community, and culture, it's protective. So if you have relational wealth, in other words, high relational health scores, at the same time that you're having these adversities, you can have 4 of these adversities before you demonstrate risk for any one of these bad outcomes. In contrast, if you have relational poverty, if you're disconnected from family, from culture, from community, even in the absence of overt traumatic adversity, you are at risk for 2 of these things. This, again, talks about the ultimate importance of relationships as both protective and healing. And after the break, I can talk a little bit about the mechanism. So I think, we're almost at the break, right? So during the break, one of the things I want you guys to think about is how much pleasure you get from talking with each other, and how much more regulated you feel, and how much more enjoyable it is to be out there interacting with other people than it is to be sitting in your ass, seriously, in a non-rhythmic, non-relational activity. And I want you to really pay attention to it, because that's part of what I'm trying to help you understand, is that rhythm and relationship open you up for both social and cognitive learning. But so many of our interventions, therapeutic, educational, and parenting, don't take advantage of relationship and rhythm. And it's something that we need to both experience and learn more about. So go get regulated, and I'll be back. You are all looking forward to the next break. Hey, listen, here's part of what I want to do in the next hour or so. I brought up a lot of different concepts that in my mind are pretty interrelated, and in your minds maybe not yet. And so what I want to do for the next 20, 30 minutes or so is take some of these concepts and try to weave them together in ways that you'll start to see some coherence between learning the principles of sensitization and learning about how important these relational templates you create early in life are, and thinking about actual real life interactions with the kids and families that we work with. So I'm sure if you sort of, in each moment as you took in some of this content, we're starting to think about potential relevance for your work, I'm sure. Some of you were probably going, I see none. Some of you were probably going, I wonder if that's what's going on with Billy. And so I'm going to try to take the next hour or so and weave this stuff together in a way that will be a little bit more coherent. Let me just say that a lot of the things that I'm writing about or speaking about we have written about in a more coherent way. And I recognize that a lot of these things, you need to sit with them for a little while and think about them. And some of the images that I've shared are helpful in thinking about them. And but I don't give out my slides in advance, because I never like to tell people that ask me to speak in advance that I have no clue what I'm going to talk about until I actually get there. Makes them very nervous. But what I do, as you saw, I have a lot of different slide presentations up. Each one of them has about 500 or so slides. And then I just we go back and forth as I feel like I need an image to sort of help reinforce a concept I'm sharing. So I'm saying all this by way of letting you know that you can get access to many of these slides if you go to our website and you ask for them. And so our website is childtrauma.org. I'll put it up before the end of the session. And there's a contact email, and you can just go there and say, hey, I was at this conference, and can you send, the best hits slides that we have? And now some of the slides will not be, familiar because I'm not going to show certain things. And then some of the slides I show here aren't in that package. But a lot of the core slides that will be helpful for you sort of thinking about this are in that package. We also have a number of other things that are available. There are some print materials that are useful for working with carers or teachers or sharing with your clinical team and so forth. So, and they're on all different kinds of topics that you might be helpful, it might be useful. So just check it out if you want more. So, you will recognize this picture, right? I showed this before. I was talking a little bit about this early developmental experience, and this red line is sort of tracing the stress response system activity of a newborn. And what I was trying to convey was that if you have an attentive, attuned, responsive caregiver, that you're going to get these patterns of moderate and, to the infant, predictable stress activations that ultimately lead to the development of a more resilient stress response system that actually is really a positive thing. It's kind of what we want to do for our children. I want to elaborate on that and go into this a little bit further. And I know that some of you, again, I know you're not neuroscientists, but I know that you can understand this concept if I explain it adequately. But I don't want you to be overwhelmed by this slide. All I'm trying to show here is that one of the most important things that happens in early life is that your brain starts to have experiences with human beings. And it is these experiences that start to help you make sense out of the world. And people in different disciplines use different language. But essentially what your brain is trying to do, and what you as a little infant are trying to do, is understand what is going on. What's the meaning of this person? Are you connected to food? Are you not connected to food? What happens, when I get upset and I'm overwhelmed, I don't understand what's going on. All these sensory cues are novel. And so, you do come, that's nice. When I get upset, I express my distress and cry. You come and you do things that are familiar. The echo of familiarity is present. You have the same smell. You use the same rhythms. You have the same warmth that I experienced in utero. And so you are returning me to some familiar sensory cues and making me become regulated. And this is one of the interesting things that happens, is that every time an attentive, attuned caregiver responds to the infant when the infant is in distress, at this point, right in here, there is this 3-part complex set of associations that are being created. Now, I showed you kind of a 2-part association, right, between 2 neural networks with that little video clip. But very, very few human experiences involve 2 sensory domains or involve 2 neural networks. They're usually very complex. So one of the most important and most complex is this 3-part association that's happening here. So a couple things to just give you a little bit of neuroscience intro. And again, I'm just going to put neuroscience language to things you already know. Number 1, everybody in this room knows that there are someplace, somewhere in your brain, there's someplace that when it gets activated, you feel pleasure, right? So we have neural networks that are involved in reward, pleasure. And so when they're activated, you feel a sensation of goodness, good. Now, you can activate that in a lot of different ways, but one of the most primal, one of the most sort of present from the moment go, is that when you relieve physiological distress, you feel pleasure. You stimulate these reward systems. Now, that's something that actually we give it the label pleasure, but that capability is even present in all kinds of other species, all the way down to a lizard. And it really is part of the yin and yang of what keeps us alive. So when we are physiologically out of sync, right, we're dehydrated in a dangerous way, we feel distress, and that's activating the stress response. And when we actually drink water and quench that, we decrease the stress response, we get regulated, but we also give ourselves a little bit of reward, a pleasure. So there's this pleasure and distress balance that's used all the time to help us do things that are in our best interests and avoid things that will harm us. And this is present in lizards all the way up to our species. Now, it's a little bit more complex in humans than lizards, but it's that fundamental architecture. So the key thing is this. When you're a baby, your brain's not that organized yet. But these lower parts of the brain, i.e. the lizard-like parts of the brain, are present. And they're pretty well organized. And so when the primary caregiver comes and decreases the physiological distress that's caused by being hungry, thirsty, or cold, you actually stimulate centers in your brain that give you pleasure. Now, this is important because over time, you're also, while this carer is basically regulating you, in other words, activating the neurobiology of regulation and activating the neurobiology of reward, your caregiver is activating all of the sensory stuff that goes with human beings. You know, your smell, your tone of voice, your touch, all of these things are going into the brain of the infant. And all these things, that comes in low, and it creates these cascades of activity, and they all end up meeting in these really important parts in the brain. And you're starting to make this complex internal representation of the external world. And I talked about the creation of the template for dog, right? You know, the template for four-legged furry creature came from the experience with the dog. And as you met more four-legged furry creatures, you modified that original template to just be some variation of dog. Big dog, big dog with horns, whatever. Little dog with attachment disorder. So, whatever the version of that four-legged furry creature is. And that template that we have for human beings comes from the collective experiences we have with our primary carers. Now, it could be mom, could be auntie, could be grandma, could be a combination of dad and mom and auntie. What usually, and most optimally, it comes from a combination of a variety of stable and consistent carers. And in fact, because the brain changes in a use-dependent way, you can't divide up relational interactions early on into equally divisible units of care. In other words, you can't have 10 different people providing primary caregiving and expect each one of them any of them to have adequate dosing or presence to create a stable relational connection. Let me give you the example of this. I think this is really important because, again, from a out-of-home caregiving experience, part of what you need to realize is your best intentions of separating a young child from whatever their primary caregiving world is and introducing them to you is disruptive. It's fragmenting. And that infant has to start over. And it's not like you undo what was previously put in. You have to build new things. Therapeutic experiences, building new attachment capabilities isn't about erasing things, it's about building in new things. And new things get built into your brain only if there's adequate repetition. So I'll come back and talk about this in more detail in a second, but here's the key thing. This carer comes in, you've got all these somatosensory cues that belong to her. Now, if you have another carer that comes in and does the same thing and meets the physiological needs of this infant, but has completely different sensory cues and rocks at a slightly different rhythm and has a different tone of voice, you're going to get a whole different set of associations between being regulated and rewarded and human stuff. It's all going to go into the same part of the brain, but it's not going to be the same experience. It's like language. If you take a child and you raise them in an environment where you speak English only and you speak to them all the time, the speech and language parts of the brain are going to change, and you're going to get all kinds of associations about stuff like the image of a dog and the sound dog means dog. But if you grow up in a household and they speak Spanish and English, you're going to get some stimulation that the sound dog means the dog, and some stimulation that, what is it? Is it perro? Perro? Yeah, see. Bene. Yeah. So that means dog. And so you get different stimulation. Now just imagine what the experience of a child would be if for, there were 10 different carers, or 10 different languages that the child was exposed to 1/10 of the day. Or you start out with, let's have a care, let's speak English for the first 3 months of your life, and then we'll start speaking Cree for the next 4 months. And then, let's change languages, let's do Japanese. Oh, let's not do Japanese, let's do Spanish. I like Spanish, let's do Spanish, it's a beautiful language. And no, we're not going to do that. And so if you had 10 serial languages, by the time you're 3, you wouldn't speak any language. It's the same thing with attachment, with relationships. If you are bounced from good caregiving, now see, all those languages are good. There's nothing wrong with them. If you take one infant and you take that infant and you have them raised by a loving carer for 3 months or 2 months, and then they move to another loving care, and then another loving care, and another loving care, they're going to build in some fundamental capabilities, and I'm not saying they're going to be really, really messed up, but they're going to have profoundly different attachment capabilities than a child that has the same core set of cares. This is one of the things that we're not very good at. We're not very good with regards to early childhood, and we're not very good with this with older kids. But we'll come back and talk about some of that in detail in a second. Let's continue with this. So here we are. Your brain starts to make these associations between people, pleasure, and regulation. And so we use these 3 R's: regulate, reward, and relationship. Those neurobiological networks get woven together when you have attentive, attuned caring. And so what will happen is, no matter how wonderful you are as a carer, you're going to have, some experiences where you're not fawning all over the child, right? You're going to have the baby on your hip, and you're going to be interacting with other people. And so there'll be certain nonverbal cues that the child begins to internalize as part of meaning that I'm part of the group, but I'm not the center of the universe, which is a good thing to learn. Make no mistake about it, it's a really good thing to learn. And and this is part of what happens as children are in a complex relational milieu, where there's people who are giving them attention and attuned love, and there's people that are giving them, you're one of the group, and when you really demand it, I'll give you attention, and it will be of a certain sort. And then there'll be times when you'll see people that are sad, and you'll see people that are frustrated, and you build this complex internal dialogue of what nonverbal cues mean in your culture. And these are very culture bound, and very family specific. So you can have a family in one culture that's much more emotionally expressive than a family in the same culture. And so, particularly when you have sort of a heterogeneous, homogenized sort of conglomerate of cultures and subcultures like the US, where you'll have, Norwegian Lutheran families, and you'll have Italian American families, and they have completely different expressed emotion. Their kids grow up learning different nonverbal cues. But the interesting thing that happens is that because these primary associations are created, you end up creating an internal representation, an internal template about what people are and what they mean. And so several things happen that are very important for understanding work with these kids. Number one, when this goes well, the best way that you can actually feel pleasure and reward is by having a relational interaction. That's the most rewarding thing. And you guys just had a little bit of examples of the reason. Here you are, professionals, you actually kind of want to learn about this topic, yet you could not tear yourselves away from talking to each other because it's so pleasurable. It's so much more rewarding than sitting and doing nothing. So the good thing about it being pleasurable is this, is that when you are a little child and you're growing up, and we as the adults are trying to teach you what is right, what is wrong, we're trying to help you do the right thing, we use learning theory. We use contingency. And so what happens is if a child's doing the right thing, we go, oh, that's awesome. And that gives you reward, and that makes you keep doing the thing that we're reinforcing you for. That's good. If you do something that's not right and they sense distress, that actually because they're so connected to you and they so want to please you, when they sense you're displeased, it's a significant stressor, right? So I think about how most of you feel who have pretty good internal representations, pretty good, internal views of the human species. When you find out that somebody called and complained about your work, it feels crappy, right? And you try to undo it. You try to figure it out. You try to, what happened? How did that? And sometimes you worry about it and you ruminate about it. It's powerful. And so what happens is when these associations are strong, you don't have to get a doctorate to come in and create a behavioral program to get Billy to comply. Because the normal transactions of human interaction, of brief reward from a smile and brief consequence from a little bit of a frown, shape behavior. Have you ever wondered why all of those same things that helped you raise your own kids in a healthy way don't seem to work with kids that are dysregulated? Or don't work very well with kids that have attachment issues? It's because those connections, that primary association between what is rewarding and human stuff, they're not the same. So here's what happens. You can have a mom or a set of primary carers who are depressed. Or you can have carers that don't activate the reward centers, but when you cry out in hunger, they come and they're frustrated. Shut the fuck up. That doesn't make you feel reward. That makes you feel scared. It's confusing. And so what you do is you activate the stress response systems, and these kids start to make associations between human intimacy and threat. So when people get close to them, they don't feel regulated. They feel threatened. And everybody has some collection of experience, where it's either you had a lot of people telling you that you were the center of the universe, and some people are here, and some people are here, and some people are here. And everybody in this room has an internal catalog about human experience and about what nonverbal cues mean, and things that you use to make sense out of the world, that you use, like I said earlier, to filter the present through your own past. And so if you had this kind of experience, and your math teacher had this kind of experience, and you're both working from what we call theory of mind. What that means is that we walk around in our own little made-up world. Make no mistake about it, it's made up. We interpret other people's behavior based upon what we would do in that situation, or what would motivate us to act that way. And then we basically make sense out of their behavior through our little context. And so when I first went up to Canada and I started working with the First Nations community up there, there were some Inuit women who'd basically taken 24 hours to get to this conference in Edmonton. They'd waited for the one flight that came out of their community, and then waited for the big city actually had 3 flights a week, and then they would come down to Edmonton. And they came up, and I was told that they wanted to meet with me because they're so excited about what, the stuff I was talking about. And they stood in front of me, and they didn't look at me, and they didn't move their hands, and they had no expression whatsoever. And I'm being culturally ignorant about that at that moment. I'm seeing somebody who's not establishing eye contact, showing no expression when I'm trying to engage them, and actually literally looking to me like they were angry or bored. And so I was interpreting this, I'm like, wow, this is really not going well. And I don't know if you've ever seen those experiments where they instruct a mother to not respond, and the baby gets more and more frenetic, and they try to do more and more stuff. So that's what I had my little still face experiment there. They were basically not giving me any relational feedback. I'm like, what the fuck? I'm like, well, maybe I should raise my voice and be more animated or be funny or what. I didn't know if I should juggle. Come on. But finally, one of the elders, the woman looked up at me and she just cracked this tiniest little smile and said, we should tell you about, the way we communicate. And I'm like, yeah. She said, well, we listen. And when we meet someone new, we want to be respectful, and eye contact is a very intimate thing for us. And so we don't really want to establish eye contact until it's invited, and we don't want to talk until you stop talking. We're just like, oh, right. But of course, we, being uncomfortable with silence, we just fill the silence with words. And it was such an interesting and wonderful learning experience. They were very gentle with me. But this is an example of when you have an internal representation of what something means and someone else has a completely different internal catalog, there's tremendous room for misunderstanding. And so here's what I'm about to tell you is that working with many of these children is a little bit like doing cross-cultural work. Their internal world and primary associations are different from yours. And so many of the people that go into this field are rescuers and helpers and healers, and people are good, and you vote, you're liberal in the liberal sense of U.S. liberal. I have no idea wherever freaking countries I go to, they just say, hey, liberal means completely different things than what I thought it meant. Anyway, but progressive maybe, would that be the term? I don't know what it is. So, but if you go into social work, if you say, hey, I'm going to take my time, energy, effort, I'm an empathic person, I'm going to let somebody come and live in my house, I'm going to help this child grow up to be better, I'm going to do the right thing, you've got a big green hump in your head. That's what you are. You're a big green humper. And most of the people in this field are big green humpers. And most of the people we're working with are big red humpers. Now, I say this kind of jokingly, but it's true. And all of you know this. You've seen that intimacy can be overwhelming for these kids. That sometimes when you try to comfort them, they'll lash out and push you away. Sometimes the people that are most loving and nurturing to them become the target of the most vitriolic, hateful, and aggressive behaviors. And it's completely confusing because they can say, I hate you, you're ruining me, I'm going to cut your throat tonight, and 10 minutes later they'll crawl in your lap and want to get a hug. So let's talk about that. That's not unexplainable behavior. It's related to these internal templates. So, we talk about this concept called the intimacy barrier. And some of you probably have, how many of you have sort of heard about that sense of the term personal space, right? And many of us have had the experience where someone had a different sense of personal space than we did. And I don't know if you ever watched Jerry Seinfeld back in the day, and they had one famous episode about the close talker, the guy who got really close. And there are people like that, and they just don't, the distance that they feel comfortable with socially, most of us don't. And so, and again, your sense of personal space is culture bound. So if you're from Japan, your sense of personal space is different if you grew up in North Dakota. North Dakota is probably in some ways populated like WA. I mean, we have more white buffalo in North Dakota than people. So we just don't have that many people. My dad used to complain about the traffic in our little town when he said, I had to wait twice at the four-way stop. Yeah, that's rough, Dad. Times are a-changing. So, it's just, I literally used to walk down the street. If I saw a kid walking on the block towards me, I would cross to the other side of the road. We were just that sense of personal space. And anyway, so personal space is one aspect of what we call this intimacy barrier, but also content. There are different people have different comfort levels with certain content. So let me just talk about this sense of both. There are certain things that most of us would feel comfortable talking about with somebody, or a certain physical distance that we would feel would be a comfortable social space. But we all have some sense of you're now in our personal space, and then there's the sense of intimate space. And so what happens is when somebody gets in your personal space or into your personal content, your stress response activates. And if they get into your intimate content or your intimate space, your stress response activates even higher. So I want to illustrate a couple of key points, basically make you laugh a little bit by telling you some stories from my life about the intimacy barrier. So here I am. I pretty much had pretty good internal templates. I had mostly positive experiences growing up. Lots of people were kind and consistent and predictable. I was a pretty lucky kid. And so I can go have a casual interaction with a complete stranger, and it doesn't feel threatening. I can actually have a conversation and talk about sport or talk about weather, and it actually can have a regulating and rewarding quality. Not always, but it can. You can have a nice conversation with somebody that you are buying a cup of coffee from or something like that. And we all have had experiences like that. Then you go in and the social interaction at your workplace or at school if you're a child is more routine. It's protocolized. And most of us, again, we can negotiate these protocolized interactions without feeling threatened. And then there are personal interactions where you have people, might be people that you work with who say, hey, how are your kids? That's getting into my personal space. Where'd you go on vacation? Blah, 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 things like that. But most of us can have that level of conversation with other people and not feel threatened. But there are some things that are in this intimate space. And so I'll give you an example. I was just moved from Chicago down to Houston, and I was working on my yard, mowing my lawn. And my neighbor, who had just met, earlier, a couple of months earlier, at like a block party, and I knew who he was, he knew who I was, but I didn't know him that well. So he comes over while I'm mowing the lawn. I sort of I don't stop the mower. I just sort of put it in neutral, and he says, hey, how you doing? I'm fine. How the kids? Fine. And he said, listen, did you have sex with your wife this weekend? Right. I mean, you're getting into that intimate territory there, right? So I'm like, initially, I didn't really, I will talk maybe later on about the stress response. What happens is the first thing is flock, which is you kind of look at the people around you and go, are you seeing what I'm seeing? But there was nobody around. So then you go up to this point where you freeze. And freeze is basically where your brain's trying to go, wait a minute, do I get ready to fight or flee? Or do I get ready to sort of shut down my body and get injured? And so you have this freeze moment where you're like, and part of you's going like, did he really say that? And I'm trying to use what we call top-down regulation, cortical modulation. I'm trying to use this executive functioning stuff that we're all supposed to have. And I'm going, I got nothing, man. It's like and I said, what? And he said, did you have sex with your wife? And like, how many times? And my whole brain's going like, oh my God. I'm like, is the window open? What way does that window face? I'm like, what the hell? I didn't think they could see me. Like, what? I'm doing this whole inventory like, oh shit. And anyway, so that was crossing that intimacy barrier, and it activated my stress response. And so finally, after he said that, I just said, listen, I got to go. And I just went I did the flee part of the fight or flight response. But I felt, I'm like, I didn't know what to make of this. Now, if he'd started banging on the door, I want to know. I would have used the fight part of the fight or flight. But the point is this, is that he sort of crossed this intimacy barrier in a bizarre way, and it activated my stress response. Now think about, remember how I showed you this, I have a linear relationship between external stressor and internal response. Imagine what you would do if you had one of those, if you had a sensitized stress response. You would be much more likely to use aggressive words to push somebody back, or even physical violence. You would not have a millisecond at that freeze part where you sort of try to figure it out. You would just go right to 90 miles an hour and you would just lash out, which is what a lot of these kids do when they feel their personal space is violated or their personal content is violated. So I'm going to tell you another story just to give you an example of a core element of violating this intimacy barrier, because it explains some of the most puzzling parts of this presentation. Excuse me. So I'm in California giving a presentation. You gotta love California. So I'm giving a presentation, and afterwards people are coming up and asking questions, and there were a group of folks. One of them was a woman who was wearing a lot of jewelry and beads and a long flowing dress and kind of looked like a hippie. And not that that's anything wrong with that. So she walks forward and she sort of pushes the other people out of the way. She kind of has this big presence, and I'm just trying to be polite and answer questions. And she says in front of all of these people, "I can tell from your aura that you're quite a sexual person." Right, I know. It's like, again, I'm going, huh. What do you say to that? So I didn't say anything. I'm like, and she kept walking forward, put her hand out. And I'm thinking, okay, let's shake hands. She's not thinking, let's shake hands. She grabs my hand and then behind my elbow and then slips that other hand up behind my neck and pulls me really close. And by then I'm going, oh God. And I put my hands on her shoulder. I'm like, I'm not much of a hugger. And I feel her sniffing around my neck. And then she licked me. It's true. Which I've been told that aura sensors are actually, that's part of the whole deal. Anyway, seriously, that was like, and it went way up the arousal continuum, and then the hyper-arousal continuum. You naughty people. And I said, I gotta go. And so I literally left. And I get out into the parking lot and I realize I left my bag and my computer and everything. I'm like, oh shit. So I hid in the bushes by the parking lot. I watched everybody leave and finally saw her leave, and I went back in and the guy had locked, the janitor guy had locked the venue, and I'm like, oh my God. So finally, I knocked and he let me in. But here's the point. Here's the really important point. It's not that I really mind having my neck licked. It's just the controllability of it. If I invite somebody across my intimacy barrier, that's one thing. But if somebody crosses your intimacy barrier either physically or with personal content without your permission, that's what activates your stress response. So these kids, many kids who will literally in one moment be touch-seeking and will seem like they feel comfortable with proximity, if you see them and they look sad and you're a big green humper, and you think, what would make me feel better after I came home from school and had a bad day? And you go over to try to give them a hug without their permission, they will tell you to fuck off. And we're like, what happened? Of course, we have to keep going after it, right? Tell me what happened. And we don't read signals that well, right? You would think that fuck off would pretty much work for most people. But if you have that big green hump, you just keep going, just like water off a duck's back. It doesn't matter. Did something bad happen at school? Let me help you. And you're escalating it. Now, you're not intending to, but you just make it worse and worse and worse. And then they get more and more threatened. Literally, they get wild. They'll threaten to kill you. Now, here's the interesting and challenging dilemma. Not only are these kids sensitized to intimacy without controllability, they're sensitized to abandonment. And so when they drive you away, they'll literally start to get more panicked again, and they'll follow you. I mean, I can't tell you how many stories I've heard of. They'll follow you in, and you'll close your door in your room, and they'll bang on the door. I hate you. You're ruining my life. That's why I'm in here. I'm leaving. And I can tell you what happens is, here's the dilemma of the carer, is that you are nurturing people and you want to help. And one day, when you interact with this kid, it seems fine. And then the next day you do the exact same thing and he blows up. And that's because all functioning of the brain is state dependent. And so his intimacy barrier will shift with his state. So if he had a crappy day at school and he started out here on that hyperarousal continuum, and he comes home and he's here and you interact with him, you want something to eat, shut up. Why are you saying shut up? You love cookies. And then he throws the cookies, and don't throw the cookies. I know, I see you out there going, oh, I know, I do that all the time. It's okay. There are ways to learn how to be with these guys that won't evoke that. And so here's what you need to remember. Here's the dilemma. When you are a little child and you're growing up and you have caregiving like this, where you've had an attentive, attuned, loving care, and they've created this sort of sensory world for you, and you can't walk, and you're basically completely dependent upon them to show you the world. In the beginning, you love the little world that you've created with this person, and you love the nurturing and the whatever, and then after a few months, 5-6 months, it's like, you're boring. Seriously. And what they want you to do is they want you to help me see other stuff. So they want to smell, touch, taste anything that you have in your hair or in your ears, and they want to. If you got, what's that blocky thing? Can I eat this? Smell, touch, and taste. The reason they do smell, touch, taste, look is because they're trying to create associations about what shiny objects that are black. Can you eat those? And after a while, they realize, well, they have no smell and they don't taste very good and they're kind of hard and you don't eat those, and so you learn not to bite those things. So they're trying to make sense out of the world, and you are the person who's controlling that world that they see. Now, a lot of parents remember the phase where the baby starts to want you to be a chariot, right? They want to be externally faced, and they give you the little giddy-up thing like that, and they want you to sort of show them around. And so they're ready to go explore the world. They feel safe with you. They're in their comfort zone, and the truth is their comfort zone is boring. You know, when I travel, and when I was younger, when my wife would stay home, I'd travel and have novelty, and at the end of the week, all I wanted was familiarity. She'd been home, and all she had was familiarity. She just wanted to get the hell out of there. Let's go do something. I'm like, oh, shit. Mismatch between where she was and where I was. And this is a very common thing when you're in a relationship. Not just about that kind of stuff, but lots of stuff. So here's the interesting thing about normal development. Normal development, children feel safe enough that their world is boring. And they seek new things. They seek novelty because they feel safe. These are the easiest kids in the world to teach because they're curious. kids who feel threatened, who are outside of their comfort zone, seek familiarity. So they're going to retreat to their tried and true styles of being regulated, which very often involves very primitive things, rocking, decreasing sensory stimuli. They create these familiar places. And so the more you push them, the more you try to pull them out of their comfort zone to do something new, which is going to require what? A transition. And oh, by the way, what's the most common thing you hear about these kids? Difficulties with transitions. It's because we are pulling them out of their comfort zone rather than making them feel safe enough for them to leave the comfort zone in a controllable way. See, they're the only ones that can determine what the dose is, right? What is a moderate, predictable activation of your stress response? You're the one that can tell what that is. I can't. For a kid who's on this curve, what a healthy dose of novelty is that will help them get a tolerance-inducing pattern to ultimately change this curve so that it's flatter. We can't determine what that is. They have to determine what it is. And so if we don't give them elements of controllability in the way they do some of this stuff, we're just going to keep creating a sensitizing pattern of activation of the stress response. And they're going to stay dysregulated and sometimes even get worse. Now, here's the dilemma. It's not a dilemma, but it's really an explanation that hopefully will lead to solutions as you think about this. When you're this little kid and you've been hanging out in your comfort zone and now you can move and ambulate and get away from mom or granny or whoever's been holding you back, you're holding me back. I got to go explore the world. They're out there crawling out and grabbing everything to eat, taste, smell. They wobble a little bit, they stand, they see the world from a different perspective. But here's what happens. Every time they leave the stable base where they feel safe and comfortable and they go crawl away, novelty, 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 they tolerate for a little while and then, they come back and they get a dose of regulation. And you all probably learned about this developmental thing of you've got your safe home base and you kind of go explore the world and you come back. All these kids are doing is controlling this incredibly positive, healthy process of a tolerance-inducing activation of the stress response, and they're making themselves more resilient. They're expanding what is familiar. They're making their comfort zone much bigger. But here's the dilemma with these, and the reason they can do this is because they have this fundamental relational safe home base. Kids who have this internal relational and or attachment capabilities where they're dysregulated, what happens with these kids is relationships have been threatening to them. So the child who's got good, healthy development has safety here with relationships, and then when they leave somebody, when they leave relational connection, they feel a little bit more dysregulated. And they'll come back and get regulated. A child who's had poor attachment experiences, they feel safest away from people. And so what we're doing, what we need to help them learn how to do is not have doses of separation, they need to have doses of connection. And it's the exact same process. If you let them control, if you are present and parallel, and let them control the relational engagement process, they'll stay there for a little while, and then they'll go back to parallel. And everybody in this room has had some experience. Think about kids you've worked with, where you were in a car, in parallel, driving. You got more verbal content from them when you did that than when you were face-to-face and not moving. How was your day? Fine. What'd you do? Nothing. You did nothing in school? Nope. I'm going to call the school. Don't be a jerk. That's the conversation. You get in the car. Take me to Billy's. I want to go play at Billy's. Okay. Billy's got a whole, Billy found some pot in his brother's room and he's thinking about smoking it. And I don't think that's right. Do you? And you're like, am I invisible? They talk when they're in parallel. It's not as overwhelming. I'll never forget the story when my wife sent me out to sort of tell the birds and the bees to my youngest son, and we were playing catch with a baseball and playing back and forth. And, I said, honey, I'm sure he already knows. I mean, they learn this stuff in pre-K now. It's part of the curriculum. And it didn't work. So I had to, you go out and tell him all okay. So I said, Robbie, you know where like babies come from? He said, stop. I'm like, what? He said, turn around. He made me turn around, and we did it back to back. So I was sitting back to back, went through the whole thing, and any questions? No. But he could tolerate it if we weren't in sort of this intimate proximity. It was safer from a distance. This is something that most of you have seen at play with the kids you work with. When they shadow you, when you're cooking, when you play a game, when you have this pattern, repetitive, rhythmic activity, let's go for a walk. If you can integrate rhythm into the activity you do with them, if you can essentially not probe, you will be amazed at how much they volunteer. There's nothing more powerful than being quiet. Being present and being quiet. And here will be a classic. Billy comes in, throws down his books, says, I hate school. Now, the big blue hump response is, school, what happened at school? Oh, I'm so sorry about school. What happened? Did somebody mean to you? Let me give you a hug. You need to learn stuff like reflective listening. You hate school. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep peeling the potatoes. Keep washing the dishes. Keep reading your magazine. Keep doing whatever. You hate school. Billy, that's it. He's got you parallel. See, he invited you across the intimacy barrier, but he wanted to see if you're going to be respectful. Whenever you get the lecture about school is your future, it's like, no, he's not going to invite you back in. But if you just are present and stay regulated, that's the key, and that's where we're going. If you stay regulated, he will ultimately capture your level of rhythm and your level of regulation. You will regulate him by your presence. And when he's regulated, he will have access to more parts of his cortex. He will have access to more parts of his central nervous system, and he will be responsive in ways that you will be surprised. So, one of the things about this neurobiology of human interconnectedness is the fact that human beings are contagious. We are such social creatures. The lowest divisible unit of our species is the clan. It's not the person. And so we are literally interconnected, interdependent with each other. And our physiology is influenced in tremendous ways by the relational milieu. And so if we have in our relational milieu a permeating mood of anxiety, we will be anxious. If we have a permeating mood of predictability and optimism, we will be optimistic. This is a very important thing. If you are in an organization, one of the things about organizational climate and one of the things about interacting with the kids that we work with is this fundamental concept that we talk about, that we refer to as the power differential. And so here's part of this relational neurobiology. Human beings have built into them this interesting sort of, if you will, barometer of relational intent, relational mood, et cetera, et cetera. And it's probably related to two things. Human beings, we've been on this planet for 250,000 years or more. In general, human beings have survived, really specifically by forming collaborative groups that hunt and gather and share what they hunt and gather. We solve problems collaboratively. We are interdependent. We need each other to survive. However, the major predators of other human beings have always been other human beings. And so our major threat has been human beings who are either overtly angry and hostile, who are within our clan, or human beings who are unknown to us from a different clan. They have different attributes. And so your brain's default response to people who are different from you, skin color, the way they talk, the way they look, is to activate your stress response and assume that they're a competitor before you assume they're a collaborator. Assume they're going to hurt you before you make the assumption that they'll help you. So the default response is threat. And so what happens, this is sort of a really, really important thing for us to understand about novelty with these kids. So if you have a child who comes into your home and he's new or she's new, the default response deep in this child's brain about who you are is that you're a threat to them. That you're really, you may say you care about me, but you're just going to be like all the others, and it's just a matter of time before you demonstrate to me that you're like other human beings. And there'll be this little bit of a honeymoon period, right, where the kid will sort of be pretty regulated, and I can't believe he did all those terrible things. In my home, he's going so well. And you go, blah, 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 blah. He just needs a little love. And then 4 months later, get this kid out of my home. Part of what happens is the brain loves familiarity. It loves to be, you love to be right more than you love to be good. And so, a child who's in an environment that's not chaotic, that's not marginalizing him, that's not threatening him, he'll tolerate it for a little while, then for a little while, then a little while. And then part of what they do is they start to get a predictable response from the environment. They're like, wow, all right, how are they going to handle this? And so they do a little provocative stuff. And then they'll do a little more provocative stuff. And they'll literally escalate to the point until when they actually get you to blow up or get the school to give them a punishment, you can feel them have an audible sigh. They're like, I guess I'm right, This is why they do this in homes, in schools, and part of the challenge is that we have to be able to tell ourselves that it's predictable that they're going to do this, and it's like riding a buck and bronco. You just got to, still be present, still be attentive, still be attuned, and to the degree possible, don't provoke them. Because we have all kinds of unintentional ways that we provoke them. So part of this has to do with this power differential. So every person you meet, your brain and their brain are sizing each other up. And if one person on the top of the power differential is like, might be somebody, you're at the top of the power differential, it might be something as simple as the fact that you're 6'10" and this person is 4 feet tall. It may be something as simple as you're 4'10", but you have a police officer's uniform and a gun, and this person's 6'10", and they are a person of color living in poverty. The power differential shifts. And so it can shift between person to person, but the reality is whenever it shifts, the person at the bottom of the power differential moves along this arousal continuum. And so if this is your baseline level of arousal, here you are sort of an active alert state and somebody interacts with you and they're at the top of the power differential, you shift down here. So how many of you have been in a meeting with your boss and you had an intention of saying something and they start out the meeting by being a little bit, let's talk about this thing. I know you want to talk about your raise, but we really need to talk about your performance. And you're like, oh shit. And you walk out of there and you haven't even talked about the raise. And you're like happy to have a job because you literally they panic you into this response. You get further and further away from the smart part of your brain. And everybody's been in a meeting where that's happened. You've all been in interactions with people where you felt sort of paralyzed, frozen from saying really what was going on cognitively. And as you move away from that event, you go, I really should have said this, and then that would have been really the smartest thing to say, and blah, blah, blah. And you come up with all these really great comebacks or these really great arguments. But when the time comes, you are here. The power differential pushes you back down. One of my favorite power differential stories, have you probably heard this power differential story? You've heard so many of my stories, but have you heard the one about the judge in Chicago? So I'm from North Dakota, and it's one of the states in the U.S., and I went to medical school in Illinois, a different state. And so for some reason, I thought that, like, if you're from North Dakota, you could park anywhere you want. I thought that was the rule. Apparently, that's not the rule in Chicago. They really care, those no parking things, they really mean no parking. So I got a few parking tickets, and I had to go to court, and I was going to try to talk myself out of these parking tickets. And so I go to this little traffic court, and there's a judge sitting up high, purposefully, intentionally, because that helps shift the power differential. So she's up there, gives me a lecture about, supposed to be a pillar of the community, being a physician, breaking the rules, and blah, blah, blah. And not only did she make me pay the tickets, she gave me extra. Had to pay extra. I was like, shit. Anyway, I was at the bottom of the power differential, so I was, yes, ma'am, and I walked out of there. So 2 months later, I'm doing my OB-GYN rotation. Coming to the office, and lo and behold, who's in the straps? Who's at the top of the power differential now, baby? Now, I did not abuse I was professional. But that's just by way of showing that different contexts, you can shift the power differential, Anyway. But one of the things that I think is so important about this whole power differential discussion is to help you all understand and put words to something that you all experience, and that is the capacity of the person-to-person interaction to either escalate or regulate another person. Now, I mentioned this before, that we create these incredibly powerful associations about what people mean. And if you create an internal representation of people as being safe and predictable and rewarding, you will be easier to be regulated by a person who has the intention of being positive and supportive, and so forth. So if you're really, really, really upset in a class and the teacher stays calm, the teacher's presence and her words can make you feel regulated. However, when there is an adult to child, and let's just use the adult to child interaction here, if there's an adult who's actually himself or herself stirred up, they're tired, they're in a system where they're not respected, they're dysregulated, and then they interact with a more dysregulated child who, if you will recall, this is their baseline. Frequently when we interact with kids like this, one of the first things we'll do is we try to use words, which is something that I would recommend that you use, but you stop thinking that words are going to be the transforming part of the interaction. Your tone of voice is more likely to have an impact than the actual words you say, particularly for somebody who's in a state of alarm. And so frequently what will happen is the teacher will come in, teacher will say, hey, Billy, you're supposed to sit down, everybody's supposed to sit down. And Billy will not sit down, and the teacher may remind Billy that, if you don't sit down, we can drop you to level 2. And again, the reminder, just the mere reminder that you're not doing what you're supposed to do is dysregulating. As most of you, if you think back on your lives, what is the last time you actually felt really regulated when somebody reminded you of something that you hadn't done correctly? Thank you so much, supervisor. Yes, now I remember. Yes, I'm supposed to have those forms in by Friday afternoon. Thank you so much. I feel so regulated. So, almost all of our interactions with somebody who's dysregulated, that use words to get people to comply, will escalate them. They just escalate them. That's why you use reflective listening when somebody's in that state. You use their own words and you echo them. You create rhythm out of that conversation, and that's regulating. Now, there's a lot of other things you can do, not just reflective listening. You can actually move your body. You can actually use the prosody in your voice. You know, you can go up and down. You can create music in your voice. One of my favorite regulating interactions was when I saw it's probably about a 65-year-old psychiatrist when I was training at Yale, who was about, 5'8". He was one of the most regulated, calming guys I ever saw. And there are a couple incidents I was with him that were just crazy. One of them was a completely paranoid schizophrenic guy who was in the emergency room, and everybody was all upset about him because he was he hadn't done anything, but he had this incredibly imposing, threatening presence. And it just made people feel frightened. So he came in, and he started literally just going, "Oh my gosh, I love the man in the moon. The man in the moon is the most amazing person I've ever met. And sometimes when I meet him, he'll give me candy. I love candy." And, everybody was looking at him like, "What in the hell are you doing?" But it was all about his voice. It was all about up and down. And he talked complete nonsense to this guy who had schizophrenia. And the guy literally you could see him. He could start to calm down and then calm down and calm down. And finally, it got to the point where he could actually titrate how regulated this guy was when the schizophrenic guy actually said, "What are you talking about?" And he did that on purpose. Because what happens is when you're under threat, remember I talked a little bit about this, the first thing you do is you shut down your cortex, where you have speech and language. And as soon as you start to get regulated, your cortex opens up, and he's all of a sudden saying, what do you, the man in the moon, what the hell are you talking about? I mean, I'm schizophrenic, but even I know that. So, unfortunately, we do a lot of this, and we don't do enough of this. One of the reasons that we have a hard time doing this, and this is kind of what I want to end this presentation on, is that because of the contagious quality of human interaction, you cannot conceivably regulate another person by your presence, and therefore open up their cortex and other good parts of their brain to learn new concepts or to develop social skills or to do all the stuff we're trying to get into these kids' brains. You can't do it if you aren't regulated. And what that means is one of the fundamental permeating pillars of quality out-of-home care has to be self-care for the carers. It has to be. Because none of all this other stuff is going to work. Now, you remember I showed you that plot about how powerful relational milieu is for buffering and healing people who have trauma-related adversity, right? There's dozens of studies that talk about different aspects of how relational milieu, predominantly provided by teachers, carers, not therapists, make a difference. But if the teachers and the carers, the frontline people who are spending all day with these kids, are tuned up, guess what they're going to do? They're only going to, at best, be able to get these kids to mirror their dysregulation. But if you have a sensitized stress response system and you have a dysregulated adult who's got a neurotypical stress response, the little bit of dysregulation we feel because we're overwhelmed and disrespected and sleep deprived is enough to escalate these kids into behavioral problems and cognitive instability. And by cognitive instability, I basically mean it's going to be hard for them to learn. So the only way we're ever going to solve these problems with these kids and put into meaningful, effective action all of the good things that you're going to talk about for the next few days is if our educators and our carers are regulated. And what regulates people? What regulates people is if they're part of a healthy community. Yet we take our carers and our frontline people and we put them in increasingly isolated situations. They're so overwhelmed they don't have time to go to their book club. They're so overwhelmed they don't have time to go exercise. They're so busy and dealing with so many things and driving kids around so much that they don't have time to participate in the interest group that the other foster carers have put together. This is something that we have to be very intentional and explicit about planning around. We've got to change the way we do this work. It is the community and the relational milieu with the carer embedded in that milieu that will make a healthy environment for these kids. Without it, we're just not going to be able to get where we want to get with these kids. Relationships heal. Relationships regulate, relationships reward, relationships teach cognitive content, but relationships cannot do that if they're not regulated relationships, if they're not respectful relationships. And the fragmentation in our culture, the disconnection from the land, the disconnection from our core values, the disconnection from understanding and valuing the values and practices of our previous generations, all of that stuff has fragmented us to the point where we are all too often isolated little bits bobbing around in this disconnected sea, trying to save drowning kids while we ourselves are in a lifeboat with a leak. If we don't think about this stuff intentionally, we will not be able to solve these problems. Now, the good news is we have lots of models for what helps. You know, you look at a lot of indigenous healing practices, a lot of indigenous kinship care models. Some of the most positive out-of-home models that we've seen didn't involve government, but involved community engagement in reserves in Alberta where we work, among other places we work. What they would typically do would be there'd be a mom who is struggling with drugs or whatever, and have a baby, and you know, the auntie and a cousin and a grandma and neighbors, this community, they know each other, they live in the same area, they'd have a little bit of a Sunday night meeting and they go, you know what, mom can't take care of this kid. So they'd say to mom, listen, we're going to have baby live with auntie. And whenever you want to come over, whenever you're sober, come over. You know, you can stay there. You can, you know, do all the caregiving stuff. We don't extrude you from the life of this child. But we also don't give you permission to introduce your chaos into this child's life. And so there's this non-punitive, distributed caregiving model that I think is something that's, I'm sure that legally it will be tough to emulate, but there are a lot of core important things that we should learn from that model. The other thing that we've seen work really, really well in the U.S. when you get an enlightened judge to do this is that, again, instead of vilifying the carer, we recognize that most of these carers themselves had the same chaos, threat, and neglect that these kids had, and they're doing their best. They're a mess. So we do joint fostering. We take both the young mother and or father into a family, and we provide connection for all of them. And again, we try not to demonize these overwhelmed carers. You know, they're 20 years old, but they've got the social skills of a 4-year-old. They've got the self-regulation skills of a 5-year-old. And if you look at their developmental histories, it's not hard to figure out why they're struggling being a parent. So there are a number of aspects of understanding state-dependent functioning, understanding regulation, and understanding the importance of appreciating rhythm and relationship in the healing process. One last thing I'm going to just throw up there is something for people in the system, and I know this relates a lot to what I've been talking about. And that is that I've sort of been talking about this state-dependent functioning on an individual basis. So when the individual has threat and they have they don't have resources and they're under some sort of physiological demand, they activate their stress response, they shut down their cortex, they don't solve problems as efficiently. It's the same thing with human living groups. And this could be a family, this could be the child welfare system, this could be a community, this could be a corporation. But the reality is, these rules about regulation are true for organizations and families as much as they are for individuals. And so very, very few of us are lucky enough to work in an organization like this, where there's resource surplus, it's a predictable, leadership model. People that are in that system feel safe and stable. Now, if you, for example, work at the Gates Foundation, that you might be in this kind of organization. But if you're working in a public system, you're in this kind of an organization. It's resource limited, unpredictable and novel, frequent changes in leadership, frequent changes in policy, continual revision of how we do our work, in part well-intended, but in part not well thought through, no offense, but it happens. The predominant affect in bureaucratic organizations is anxiety, which leads to behaviors that are risk aversive and involve covering your ass. And so what happens is, if you grow up in an organization like that, you end up the people at the bottom of the power differential. In an organization, this would be the staff, frontline staff. They're basically viewed as in an ambivalent way until they mess up, and then there's obsessive over-controlling, practices, which of course make these individuals be extremely dysregulated and therefore incapable of doing high-quality frontline work. In other words, what I'm telling you is the very structure of our systems undermines the effectiveness of the frontline people doing this work. And we have to think about this. We have to think about how are we going to, and I'm convinced that we can. We can figure some of this stuff out. But we will never figure it out if we don't understand that this stuff exists. So, as you move forward in the next couple of days, you're probably going to hear about a couple of things. Number one, the sanctuary model. The sanctuary model actually is structured to act on this middle column. It's intended to create an organizational climate of respect, that allows the frontline people who are working with families and children to themselves be regulated enough so that they are the most efficient tool that they can be in the change process. And I would encourage those of you who don't know about Sanctuary to learn a little bit more about it. Whether you actually use Sanctuary or you implement some of the core aspects of Sanctuary, you will be better off as an organizational unit by doing so. The second part of this is that I really think that what this means is, and again, we can't necessarily count on the organizations that we work in to make us regulated, to put in place policies that are going to allow us to have opportunities for being optimally regulated. And so that means we have to look to ourselves and to each other, our coworkers, to create respectful, regulating moment-to-moment interactions. And we have to look at how we maintain high-quality self-care practices once we leave work. We need to take our vacation days. We need to make sure we eat right, sleep right. I know this sounds very simplistic, but these things are fundamentally essential to you being at the top of your game when you do this hard work. And it's hard work. Because the truth is, you're going to go out and be in a relational environment that's going to view you as an outsider, that's going to treat you with disrespect until they get to know you, and then maybe they can embrace you and you can be an agent of change. But you're not doing easy work. It's tough work. But it's important work. It's changing the future of many, many individual kids, and I think through that, it's changing the direction of your communities, and through that, the direction of our society in ways that I believe are positive. So I want to just let you know that I encourage you to enjoy the next few days. Think together, work together, regulate each other, have some reward. And I appreciate your attention, and thank you, and good luck in your work.